It's good to see you with us tonight. There's a lot of colds and flus and sicknesses of all types and kinds going around, but I'm glad there's a number of us who are able to be out tonight and to study from God's Word together this evening. Grab your lesson sheets if you have your question sheets and you want to look at them as we go through them. We're going to look at the questions for chapter 10 by way of review, and then we'll move into chapter 11 this evening. So let's look at the questions for chapter 10 as a review, and then we'll move into chapter 11 together this evening. So in John chapter 10 and verse 1, John saw which of those things? He saw a mighty angel there in John, or in chapter 10 and verse 1. And the description of that angel suggests one of high rank, but whether I'm that's a hard term for think about that term sometimes, high rank, but at any rate, of import, right? No question about that. An angel of import in relationship to the work and duty and service that it was going to have to render. And it was described as clothed with and we generally think of a cloud in relationship to okay. All right, we have those, but generally in the Old Testament references, the cloud was generally associated with times it leading, but it generally in the text we have that from these other texts that are parallel to this one. Generally, you see the judgment that comes in the clouds. He had a rainbow. When we think of the mercy of God and the covenant of God, when we think of a rainbow, his face was like the sun, and his feet were like a pillar of fire. Okay, so quite an interesting description here, and quite an interesting picture when he would see this image here in Revelation chapter 10. In his hand was some translations say a little book or a book open, and he set his right foot in the sea and his left foot on the land. This all-encompassing situation. He cried with a loud voice as when a lion roars, and when he cried out, 7 thunders. And we talked about the fact 7's that complete, that perfect number, right? Recognize, and so just you can only imagine. Here's this image of the sun, this lion image, the cloud, the rainbow, and then a voice, if you will, that thunders and roars when it speaks. What the voices of the 7 thunders? Which of those? I can't read that question right for some reason. Okay, yeah, he was told what those 7 or what the voices of the 7 thunders said. He was told that those things he was to seal up. That up until this point, it was write it down, write it down, write it down. But this moment, he says, we're not going to write this down. As John went to write it, those events down. Lifting up the right hand indicates if you looked at, and I'm hearing a couple of different things. If you looked at those other texts, which one did you think you maybe pointed to? Yeah, that's what I had to. That's what I was thinking. And again, I'm trying to think like the writer of the worksheets when I'm answering these questions, because he may not think exactly the same as I do in terms of going through the narrative. But I think that's what he was driving at. Was here's a witness, a covenant, a vow, and this raising of the hand that is connected with that. And you see that imagery pushed forward even into modern times. Yeah. The angel swore that there should be time no longer, meaning no more delay, right? That there was a period of delay, there's an interlude, there's all these different things as this description continues. But when you get to this angel, all the delay's over. And the judgment's coming. And the events and circumstances are going to unfold. The mystery of God is, and he gave you half a dozen or so different texts that you could examine. But which conclusion would you make about that mystery of God? Yeah, I think that again, the writer of the worksheets is trying to get us to consider the fact that in God's due time, He was going to bring His plan of redemption. That's the message that upsets folks, that causes them to become oppressors of Christians. When that message of redemption is beginning to be taught and it points to Jesus, that's when the challenges begin to take hold that are going to have to last for a period of time before there's a resolution to those as well. John was told to take the little book and eat it, right? And in his mouth it would be sweet, right? And in his stomach it would be bitter. Initially, what that tells me is it's wonderful, right? But when you ingest this message, you become a believer in it and a practicer of it and a presenter of that message. There's going to be some bitterness that comes with that as well. And though it may be beautifully palatable and sweet to you personally, it can bring and will bring certain consequences when you live faithfully to that message. Yeah. Yeah. And let me suggest to you, Roger, and I didn't talk a lot about this Sunday when we went through chapter 10, but it's worth us stopping for a moment and consider in relationship to this question. And that is, in some ways, that's the message of modern religious culture, is all we tell people are the things that are sweet. And they're not told that when you really commit yourself to the truth, when you really commit yourself to the purity of the gospel, there's going to be some bitterness that comes along with that. There's going to be some challenges, and there's going to be some hurdles to overcome, some trials to overcome. And that's the part of the message that a lot of guys would just assume hide. But I believe it to be true in the days of John. It's true for those who were believers in those days, and it continues to be true. That though it might seem so wonderful to me on a personal level, it does come with challenge and consequence when we really live the standard of God. And then ultimately, what was John told to do? Okay, go prophesy or go talk about, you're going to have opportunities to go and share this with kings and other peoples and all kinds of opportunities. So his work's not done. Though he's aging, and he's in somewhat of a predicament at the moment he's writing these things, God tells him there's still going to be opportunities out there for him to be personally involved in sharing this message. And history seems to bear that out as well in terms of the work of John. Okay, so let's look at chapter 11. And we're, in some ways, not that we haven't seen symbolism and imagery up to this point, but we're really going to start getting heavy into trying to grasp the imagery and the symbols and the signs that are presented in these texts as we move forward, especially from this moment forward in our study. So we're in the midst of these woes and challenges that have been presented, and the varying angels and circumstances that are revealed to John. And at this point in chapter 11, it states that there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein. And so you would have, there's no laser guided systems to use like they do now to measure things and get and they would have measuring tools of varying types, and a reed would be one. Once a certain length of a reed might be measured and proven to be fair in terms of its measurement, then you can use it as a standard by which to measure other things against. I do not believe in any way here that he's talking about literally go measure the temple. For one thing, generally speaking, that's probably something that they would have what? Yeah, they would already have known it, right? They would have already known that. That's not information that would have been withheld. They would have had record of how and when it was built and the measurements thereby. And so this is not, to me at all, any kind of implication that he's talking about measuring the literal temple. Irregardless, to be quite honest with you, irregardless of which date you take in relationship to when the book of Revelation was written. Even if you take the early date that happens prior to AD 70, which I do not, but even if you did, it's still not a reference to that literal temple. In fact, he says, measure the temple and the altar and what? And them that worship therein. And then he makes a contrast. Add verse 2 and then we'll talk about them together. But the court, which is without the temple, leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. There are many occasions in Scripture where if you're trying to contrast those who belong to God and those who do not, that the word Gentile would be used. And so I believe what you have here is very simple in the sense that you have in verse 1, you have a description of him measuring out or numbering, if you will, the worshipers, the believers, those who are faithful unto God. Then he says, don't measure those who are outside of that temple, this symbolic temple, which, by the way, I would simply refer to you that I believe is the church that he's referring to here. And so he says, measure them up, number them, the true worshipers. And then there's this group that are on the outside, he says. There's no need to number them. But he makes a distinction between the worshipers and those who he refers to symbolically as Gentiles, or those who are outside of relationship with God. Let me share a couple of passages with you. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? This description of using the term temple to refer to God's people. We are the temple now. It's not a matter of a structure that sits in Jerusalem any longer under New Covenant law. He says you are the temple. You are the place, in other words, where God, what? Dwells, right? You're where God dwells. There was a period of time where God's house was the temple. They built for God a house. And that's where God dwelled. And that's where they went to make their connection to Jehovah. We're the temple now. And that description, I don't think, is all that foreign then to what he's talking about there in Revelation chapter 11. Notice Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20. And are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto what? A holy temple in the Lord. And so here's this imagery that even the Apostle Paul uses with those in Corinth and those at Ephesus, referring to the people of Jesus, referring to the church, referring to the believers as the temple. We're the temple now. And so when he makes this distinction here in Revelation chapter 11 and begins to tell them that there's a group that are within, there are the worshipers who are being measured and noted by the Creator, and he wants John involved in this symbolic way. And then there are those who are without. And those who are without are actually going to have a period of time where they can do what, according to the end of verse 2? Yeah, they're going to be able to create some havoc. Those who are outside of Christ are going to be given opportunity to create some challenge and havoc. It's an interesting number here, by the way. 42, generally thought of as simply an incomplete number. 42 would be in relationship, or 42 months would be how long? Yeah, 1,260 days, which we'll see later, and it also will be 3.5 years, right? Not a complete number. It's an incomplete number. In other words, he's not trying to fix a particular length of time they're going to be allowed to do things. He's basically saying, as far as men will know, it's an incomplete number. It's not a fixed number or length of time that we're dealing with here. And so he uses 42 months. He uses 1,260 days, which we'll see later. He uses 3.5 later in the narrative as well. And so most likely just simply meaning an incomplete length of time. That they would be allowed to create challenge and difficulty for God's people, and they would need measured in some senses for the body. The church would need measured in some senses for a sense of protection. Go back to Zechariah. Go back in your Old Testament for a moment. In Zechariah chapter 2 and in verse 1. He says, I lifted up mine eyes again and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. And then said I, Whither goest thou? And he said unto me, To measure Jerusalem. Now, was he really going to walk and, here's this image. What are you doing? I'm going to measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth thereof and what is the length thereof. And behold, the angel that talked with me went forth, and another angel went out to meet him, and said unto him, Run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls for the multitude of men and cattle therein. For I, saith the Lord, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. In the book of Zechariah here, the illustration that is given is the fact that when they measured Jerusalem, the purpose of measuring Jerusalem was to illustrate that measurement was going to be God's protection towards those people. That He would be a wall of fire around them and protect them. In Revelation chapter 11, what do we have going on? We have a measuring of the people. And he says there's those who are worshipers that are in. There are those who are outside who can trample and tread with their feet. But ultimately, God can bring protection to them in the midst of those difficulties. Verse 3. And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now, you can have a variety of ideas. This idea of 2 witnesses. Some take it to mean the idea of strength. I want you to, let me share a couple of passages with you. Go to Luke chapter 10 for a moment, and Luke in verse 1. He says, After these things the Lord appointed other 70 also, and He sent them 2 and 2 before His face into every city and place, whither He Himself would come. When Jesus sent forth His disciples, when He sent them out to begin to present the gospel, He sent them in what measure? 2 by 2. He understood that there would be a greater strength if there were 2 of them involved in that effort. If you go back to the Old Testament, what power did 2 people have? Let me think about that. That's right. By the mouth of 2 witnesses, a man's life could be taken from him. And so there is power in 2 witnesses. There's strength in sending them 2 by 2. But others might mention or think that the 2 witnesses here are simply the Old and New Testaments. You have 2 witnesses that proclaim the message as a predecessor to the New Covenant. You have the Old Testament law, with its prophecies and its teachings and its utterances that lead us to the time of Christ. And so it serves as a witness of Jesus and the redemptive message He's going to bring. The new covenant is a secondary witness or a second witness to the things that Jesus did and the message that He presents. And so some state that the Old and New Testaments are what these two witnesses are. I think both of those ideas probably have some validity to them. But both relate to the idea of the strength that was going to be needed to continue to present the message of redemption in a world that didn't want the message of redemption. And so this strength is going to be put forth. I will give power, notice it, I'll give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy this length of time, clothed in sackcloth, which is a sign of what? Humility, okay, mourning at times. And so though they have power, and though they're going to do this tremendous work, it doesn't come without its own set of burdens and difficulties. And so this presentation, these are the two olive trees and the two candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. Again, the imagery, possibly the idea of this power of the burning candlestick. And if you've got the olive tree, what can you do with this candlestick or this lamp? If you've got a source to make oil, what can you make the lamp do? And you can make it shine continuously. And so you have candlestick, lamp, light, and with the olive tree, you have the ability to let that light continue to be lit, and possibly this imagery showing the early success of the gospel in terms, if you were trying to look at it chronologically, and you begin to see how that early success where thousands of people are responding initially to the gospel of Jesus when that light is first being presented. And so in many ways, I think chapter 11 is a process of time. And an incomplete number, and a number that he's not specifically identifying of how long. But he shows a process where the message begins to be presented, it's given power. The Gentile world has the right, in a sense, or maybe the better word would be the ability to reject that message if they so choose. And they may trot it underfoot. Isn't that what Jesus said? Some would do. And so again, this simple picture of the early process of the gospel message of redemption being presented. That early light burning brightly, but eventually challenge will come. If any man, verse 5, will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. I thought a lot about that. Who's being killed? And why? And in what manner? And I don't know that there's any reason for us to all of a sudden switch to a literal interpretation of this. I don't know why we would see these symbolic imageries, and then all of a sudden say, but somebody's really going to die. I don't know that that's necessary. I believe what he's simply saying is that though there may be oppressors, though there may be those who reject, though there may be those who are not interested in this message, the message will continue. And what's the weapon that Christians have? The sword of the Spirit, right? They have the message, the word. What's going to happen? Where's the fire coming from? Out of their mouth, by the things they say. How are they going to defeat the enemy? They're going to draw a sword to kill him? Not a real one, right? They're going to preach the message. They're going to let the message do the work. And there are going to be times where they're going to face challenges, and when that early gospel is being presented, that process begins to unfold, there are going to be those who challenge it and create difficulties for it. And the weapon is going to be the Word of God. The fire that comes from their mouth is how they're going to, if you will, face these difficulties and win these battles, not in some physical warfare, but with the communication of the testimony of Jesus. I'll pause for a second. I'll slam it quick if I have to.
And I've read in Malachi, at the end of Malachi, and I'm trying to figure out why can't these be two little witnesses? Because I've read, things where it's talking about Elijah and Moses, and I've read certain things, and there's certain scripture references to that, and I just don't understand why, that can't be. Some of this can be literal. That's pretty descriptive. And I'm just reading along there. Some of the things they can do, plagues, and into the context of what it's saying. Elijah and Moses basically dealt with the same thing.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering what you thought.
Yeah. No, and it's as plausible as any other. In fairness to it.
And I want to make sure I'm not off base. What I'm talking about, one of the places was in Malachi. Let's see, chapter 4. I think it's the last part of Malachi. Malachi 4 through 6, I guess. And it's talking about, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet who will come into great danger of the day of war.
Yeah.
And, I'm just looking at language, and it's pretty common language. But, I've been kind of looking at this too. I thought, maybe it might be Moses and Elijah. Maybe it might be Elijah and Enoch.
Yeah.
But then I thought, well, every man's appointed to die once.
Yeah.
And neither did.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah. There's potential in this. There is an Elijah, a prophet. You know what I mean? A prophet that comes before the judgments of God, and generally that's always the case. Maybe not the Elijah, but an Elijah or a Elijah comes always before a judgment of God. And Brian, I'll be as honest with you as you have been with me. I can see how there may have been an ability for them to grasp a hold of this concept of who these two witnesses are easier than we can. There may have been conversations in their times concerning the work of Moses and Elijah in deeper or different ways than what we discuss those men in. And so I wouldn't argue against the idea. It may not have been what jumped out at me, but that doesn't mean it's not plausible that he had something more specific in mind in terms of those. And certainly some of the imagery does fit. The kinds of things that they're going to do, these witnesses are going to do, as did these other men. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, and there are certainly, you add verse 6, and there are certainly a very descriptive imagery in verse 6 of Revelation chapter 11 that points right at Elijah and Moses without question. If I asked any Bible class child, probably if I asked them, what prophet that could stop the rain, what prophet or what person in the Old Testament brought forth the plagues, they tell you Elijah and Moses did. And so here would be the only thing that I'd have to work through on that is that, notice he said that it rained not in the days of their prophecy and have power over waters to turn them into blood, which we saw Moses do, and to smite the earth with all plagues, which he did, in terms of working with God, obviously. But the as often as they will is where I'm trying to figure out. Okay, is because obviously Moses didn't keep doing plagues. And so that phrase is what hung me up a little bit on trying to pinpoint a single entity or single person. Though there is no doubt whatsoever that I would conclude, in fairness, I believe, even to the times in which this was written, that most likely when they saw that imagery, those are the two guys they thought of. And whether they thought of them literally or whether they thought of them as symbolic pictures of what they could become in the spread of the gospel, I can't say because I wasn't there. But there is no question that those are the men that would come to mind when you would read this picture. And then he says in verse 7, when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them, and kill them. So you've got this, to me, this redemptive message, this light that's coming forth, and this spread of the gospel. And then as soon as you have it in some senses in beginning to have its completed form, immediately Satan begins to work to stop its progression. If you think about it, Satan, his ability to stop the spread of salvation and the redemptive message of Jesus, the earlier he can stymie it, the earlier he can stop the spread of that message, the greater success he'll have. And so immediately here comes this, as soon as that gospel really begins to take hold, here comes Satan warring against it. And for a period of time having what? Having some success at it. And you could go in biblical history, you could go, you think about what the Apostle Paul said. He says, there is an open door to me, but there are what? Many adversaries, right? There's a great opportunity for me to spread the gospel, but there are many adversaries. There's lots of components attempting to stop the spread of the gospel. And so you see this initial success, and then here comes Satan to do all he can to stop. And then notice verse 8, their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. My thought is that he's simply referring to those, as we've already seen, who died spreading the gospel. And they're referenced as dying in the same place that the Lord was what? Where he was crucified. What I appreciate about that is that not in every sense of the word, but from the symbolic sense that is being depicted here, those who were willing to give their lives for the spread and teaching of the gospel are given the relationship of being directly connected to the crucifixion of Jesus in this picture. That in the imagery that is given, they are as though they were on a cross outside of the city of Jerusalem when it happens. And there's obviously tremendous sadness, and there's obviously a tremendous sense upon the oppressors and on Satan's part and on all those who are working for him that they've gained some success. You think about those apostles. You think about from the time of Stephen, okay? You think about Stephen being the first what? We call him the first Christian martyrs. First one we see within Scripture that dies for the cause. And from that point forward, what do we see among those who take pretty vocal stands in relationship to Jesus? One by one, they're dying, right? One by one, Satan is gaining victories by putting to death one after another of those who are presenting the message of Jesus. And for a period of time, it may even seem like they're being victorious in that effort. But he says, they of the people, verse 9, and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. The focus I want you to have, because it's pretty gruesome in terms of symbolism, but I want you to focus on one simple thing. And that is, he said, for 3.5 days. An incomplete number. In other words, this isn't forever. There will come a point in time where we're going to come out the other side of this. And there may be a period of time where lots of people are dying for the cause of Christ. And lots of folks are losing their lives because they are moving and pushing forward the message of Jesus. But it's temporary. And we will come out the other side of this, the prophecy says. And we're going to come out the other side, and the gospel will have freer course than maybe it did in its first 100 or 200 years of its existence. And we could go back into history and show us that's exactly what happened. That in those first couple of 100 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and the initiation of the gospel, how so many efforts were put forth to try to stop the spread of that message. But yet God's intention was for that message to go where? All the earth, right? Over all the earth. And that's exactly what was able to happen. Even though in its early days there were so many who tried to stop the spread of it. Yep, I'm listening. Yeah. I don't see it as coincidence that there are some pictures here that are matching the kinds of things that they would see in literal deaths. I think that in many ways, I think the prophecy works in a better way, if you will, if they are able to look and say, well, okay, I know what this significance has in real life, and then they're able to take that and say, well, here's what spiritual meaning is as it relates here to what's happening. So yeah, I see some of that without question here. Any other thoughts? So he says, the people and kindreds in verse 9, tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. They'll scoff, they'll mock, and bring shame and reproach over those who are striving to just simply present the message of Jesus. They that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth. And now I can see, kind of back to what Brian was talking about earlier, there's some very literalness in that kind of language there when he says, and these two prophets created a tremendous challenge for the folks on the earth. Either way you look at it, the implication to me is that when that message and that witness of that gospel begins to take its root, and it was resisted and fought against, and when there appeared to be a success in stopping its progression, those who dwelt upon the earth are said to have rejoiced over that and to make merry. And it's interesting, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth. It appears to be a what? It's a celebration, right? It appears to be a celebration because they have convinced themselves that they have reigned victorious over these witnesses, over this spread of this message, over the gospel continuing to be presented. It's eerie when you think about it. I am not one who places too much modern day connection to these symbolic images. But there are parallels, aren't there? We have seen men celebrate the death of believers. We have seen men who would give gifts to others if they were victorious over those who are believers in Jesus Christ. And again, I'm not in any way saying that Revelation chapter 11 is pointing right to our 2016 world. But it's definitely parallel. Even if it's not specific, it's definitely parallel to the kinds of things that we still, here we are quite a while later from their time period. And we still see people celebrate and find a morbid sense of joy when believers in Jesus suffer and suffer harm, and would even reward one another when that happens. I just saw it generally, Roger, as just the world itself, not necessarily. The beast is the center point in terms of Satan being the director, if you will, of these calamities and challenges. But he uses the people and nations and kindreds of folks across the globe to do his bidding. And that was the picture I saw.
I'm glad he said that. Do you think when it says beast, and again, I know some of this is minimal, but is it referring back to Daniel? Talking about four beasts. I think there's something to that, maybe.
Yeah, I think that there's. Yeah, there's. I'll be honest with you. There's probably a lot more than I have pointed to out of the book of Daniel. There's more than we could be pointing to probably at times in the things that Daniel prophesied concerning. And even some of the things he prophesied might even point you in more specific ways to times of men like Antiochus Epiphanes, and there's all kinds of things you could think about in relationship to the difficulties that came.
I mean, studying Daniel really helped me.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see the pictures and the parallels between them. So he says, and after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them. And they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. So you go through this period of time where there's calamity and turmoil and difficulty and every effort being made to stop the progression of the gospel. And then you come out of that on the other side. And on the other side of that, he says, is a time period where these that have been challenged and faced great difficulty are able to stand back up on their feet again. Fear falls upon those who stood in direct opposition to the spread of the gospel, as they see that what they may have thought was victory over it wasn't quite what it seemed. And there's a reward extended from the Creator. And their enemies are beholding all. In other words, the same people who were witnesses to the demise of Christianity in its early days became the witnesses to the resurgence of that same message. and the power that it began to have to affect more and more people as it began to have greater spread. And the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell. And in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted, and gave glory to the God of heaven. And we've kind of forgotten about this because seems like so long ago, but he says, in the second what? The second woe was past. All of that we've been looking at over the last 2.5 weeks, part of that second woe that came. And it is now past. And behold, the third's on its way. He says there in verse 14. Yeah. Yeah. The confidences they're building in their efforts are worthwhile. So the seventh angel sounds, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of his world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. The full intent of the gospel and the full intent of bringing Jesus was ultimately to put all nations under the feet of Jesus. And there may be a sense when you see earthly nations having success at creating difficulties for the gospel, there may be some who conclude that maybe Jesus isn't reigning. And maybe he doesn't have power over the nations. Maybe he isn't as successful as he claimed he was going to be. But that period of time is gone. And the reign and the power of Jesus begins to take center stage again. The 24 elders which sat before God on their seats fell upon their faces and worshiped God. We go from the sadness of what seems like the defeat of the gospel to again the victorious nature of Jesus and his message reigning true. The 24 elders begin to praise and worship God. They say, saying, we give thee thanks, O Lord God Almighty, which art and wast and art to come, because thou hast taken to thee thy great power and hast reigned. And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants, the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. And so there's disappointment on behalf of those nations and peoples who were striving to end the spread of the gospel. And they see the reward and the benefit and the success of the followers of God and the followers of Jesus, small and great. And the progression of that is simply illustrating that though there may be a period of time where difficulties seemed overwhelming to the spread of the gospel, ultimately the success came. And the temple of God was opened in heaven. And there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. And my conclusion is that what you have in verses 18 and 19 is a proclamation. If you were trying to show this chronologically, you would see the early success of the gospel. Then as it tried to spread, there were those who tried to stop it. That worked for a period of time. Then some 200 or so years later, you start to come out of that. And when you start to come out of that defeatism and you come out of that darkness, what happens is the destruction of the Roman power that's been the great oppressor to this. And you can see some of the matching time periods as you look at it from that perspective. Okay, Lord willing, we'll come back, answer questions for chapter 11, and we'll move into chapter 12 on Sunday.